Tears streamed down Clara Miller's face as the word "fired" echoed in the noisy diner, at syllable, a hammer blow to her already fragile world. Her manager's voice was cold, clinical, citing breach of company policy and unauthorized transactions. The transgression. Paying for a hungry, destitute man's $15 meal with her own tip money. As she was escorted out, her uniform stripped from her, she felt the burning stares of co-workers and customers. She had lost everything for a simple act of kindness. But what she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the homeless man she helped was no homeless man at all. And his return the next day wouldn't just change her life. It would shatter the very foundations of the multi-million-dollar corporation that had just cast her aside. The alarm on Clara Miller's phone didn't so much chime as it shrieked a piercing 500 AM digital scream that sliced through the thin walls of her small apartment. For a moment she lay still, the familiar ache in her lower back, a dull reminder of yesterday's 12-hour shift. The scent of stale coffee and the faint, sweet smell of her son's lavender-scented laundry detergent hung in the air. This was her world, a symphony of exhaustion and love played on a loop. She slid out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold linoleum. In the other room, her 7-year-old son Leo coughed a dry, rattling sound that made her heart seize every time. His asthma was a constant, unwelcome guest in their lives, its presence dictated by the changing seasons, the city pollution, and the cruel lottery of genetics. The new nebulizer sat on his bedside table, a plastic monument to their last emergency room visit and the mountain of debt it had created. Clara was 29, but on mornings like this she felt 100. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. The bright, hopeful eyes of her youth were now framed by faint lines of worry. Her blonde hair, once her pride, was perpetually pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. She was a waitress at the Golden Spoon Diner, a mid-tier establishment owned by the sprawling corporate giant Kensington Eateries, Inc. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was a job. It paid the rent just barely, and kept Leo's inhalers filled most of the time. The uniform was a drab polyester affair, a pale yellow dress that always seemed to smell of fryer oil, no matter how many times she washed it. As she buttoned it up, she ran through the day's mental checklist. Drop Leo at Mrs. Gable's. Pray there's no traffic. Remember the Wednesday soup special is clam chowder, and most importantly, stay on the right side of Brenda Vance. Brenda was the diner's manager, a woman who seemed to be forged from steel corporate policy and burnt coffee. She managed with a clipboard in one hand and a stopwatch in the other. To Brenda, customers weren't people. They were tickets. Employees weren't a team. They were units of labor. Everything was a metric table, turn time, average, guest check, side dish, upsell percentage. Compassion was an inefficient variable she had long since eliminated from her management equation. Miller, you're 3 minutes late, Brenda would say if Clara clocked in at 6:03 a.m. That's 180 seconds of unproductive labor cost the company has to absorb. Clara swallowed a dry piece of toast, kissed a sleeping Leo on the forehead, and whispered, "Be good for Mrs. Gable, sweetie. Mummy loves you." She scribbled a note, left it on the counter with a small glass of juice, and slipped out into the pre-dawn chill of the Chicago streets. The Golden Spoon Diner was already humming with a low-level anxiety when she arrived. The cooks were slapping bacon on the griddle, the dishwashers were clattering racks of plates, and the other morning shift waitresses were rushing around, their faces tight with a practiced, joyless urgency. "Morning, Clara," sighed Maria, another waitress, as she filled a tray with coffee mugs. "Brenda's on a warpath today. Mark Renshaw is coming." Clara's stomach tightened. Mark Renshaw was the regional manager, a corporate shark known for his surprise inspections and his penchant for firing staff to streamline operations. His visits meant Brenda would be 10 times more demanding, scrutinizing every pour of coffee, every crumb on the floor. "Great," Clara muttered, tying her apron. "Just what we need." The morning rush was a blur of frantic activity. Orders were shouted, plates were delivered, and coffee was sloshed. Clara moved with an efficiency born of years of practice, a forced smile plastered on her face. She was polite to the grumpy old man in booth 4, who always complained his coffee was too hot. She was patient with the table of indecisive tourists. She even managed a genuine laugh for Mr. Henderson, a regular who told the same joke every single day. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Brenda's hawk-like eyes, following her every move. She saw Brenda tap her watch as Clara spent an extra minute helping Mr. Henderson find his dropped glasses. She saw the slight frown when a child at one of her tables spilled a glass of water, forcing Clara to stop and clean it up. By midday, the initial rush had subsided into a steady, manageable flow. Clara finally had a moment to breathe, leaning against the service counter and rubbing her aching feet. Her tips so far were meager. She did a quick mental calculation. After paying Mrs. Gable and buying groceries, there would be barely enough to cover the copay for Leo's new prescription. The anxiety never far from the surface began to bubble up again. She had to make more. She had to get more tables, turn them faster, upsell more desserts. She had to be the perfect employee. It was then at precisely 1:15 p.m. that the bell above the diner door jingled and a man shuffled in. He was the kind of person most people try not to see. His clothes were ragged, his graying hair was matted, and his face was etched with the kind of deep, weary lines that speak of a life lived on the harsh edges of society. He hesitated at the door, as if unsure of his welcome, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of hunger and shame. Brenda, standing near the cash register, saw him immediately. Her lips thinned into a razor-straight line. She was already moving towards him, her body language radiating hostility, ready to eject him before he could even take a step further. But Clara, whose station included the empty tables by the door, saw him first. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in his, she didn't see a nuisance or a problem. She saw a profound and desperate exhaustion. Acting on an instinct she couldn't explain, she picked up a menu, stepped in front of a glaring Brenda, and gave the man a small, gentle smile. "Table for 1?" she asked, her voice soft. The man looked surprised, then nodded slowly. Brenda stopped dead in her tracks, her face a mask of incandescent fury. The battle lines had just been drawn at table 7, and Clara had no idea she was fighting for a man who held the entire world in his hands. The man slid into the cracked vinyl of the booth at table 7, moving with a stiff awkwardness as if his body ached. He hunched over the menu Clara handed him, though he didn't seem to be reading it. His gaze was distant, his hands trembling slightly as he folded and unfolded the corner of the laminated page. From across the room, Clara could feel Brenda's stare burning into her back. It was a direct act of defiance to have seated him, and they both knew it. Clara approached the table, her notepad in hand. "Can I get you something to drink to start coffees fresh?" The man looked up. His eyes, she noticed, were a surprisingly clear, intelligent blue, though they were clouded with weariness. Just water, please. Thank you." His voice was raspy, unused. When she returned with the water, he still hadn't opened the menu. He was just staring out the window, watching the city rush by a solitary island in the bustling diner. "Have you decided what you'd like?" Clara asked, gently, trying to keep her tone professional. He flinched slightly, as if startled from a deep thought. "Oh, He looked down at the menu, then back at her, a deep flush of shame coloring his weathered cheeks. "What's the cheapest thing you've got that's filling?" he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the table. Clara's heart broke a little. She'd heard that question before in different forms. The single mother trying to feed 2 kids on $10. The student with his laptop trying to make 1 coffee last for 4 hours of free Wi-Fi. "The sunrise special is our best value," she said, pointing to the all-day breakfast section. 2 eggs, bacon toast, and hash browns. It's $10. Or..." She leaned in, a little lowering her voice. "The kitchen staff made a big batch of beef stew for their own lunch. It's not on the menu, but it's hearty. I can get you a big bowl of that for $5. Comes with bread." His head shot up, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "The stew," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, please. Thank you." As Clara walked to the kitchen to place the order, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she'd gotten into service in the first place, years ago, before life had worn her down. It was about the simple human act of feeding someone, of offering a moment of comfort and care. The man who had mumbled his name was Art, ate the stew, with a slow, deliberate hunger that suggested he was savoring every single bite. He didn't wolf it down like a starving man. He ate with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. He cleaned the bowl with the piece of bread, his movements methodical. Clara kept his water glass full, checking on him, as she would any other customer, despite Brenda's increasingly obvious glares and pointed gestures towards the other, more profitable tables in her section. Art was a silent customer. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, but he watched. Clara didn't know it, but he was watching everything. He watched her patiently explain the menu to an elderly couple who couldn't read the small print. He saw her slip a handful of crayons and a coloring page to a restless toddler, earning a grateful smile from the frazzled mother. He saw her expertly juggle 6 plates on her arm, her movements efficient and graceful, despite her obvious fatigue. He saw her co-worker Maria drop a tray of glasses, and he watched as Clara was the first one there. Not with a complaint, but with a quiet, "Don't worry, I've got it," as she helped pick up the shards of broken glass. Most of all, he noticed the interactions with Brenda. He saw the manager reprimand Clara in hushed, angry tones for spending too long at his table. "Your job is to maximize turnover, Miller, not run a charity. That booth has been occupied for 45 minutes for a $5 sale. Unacceptable." Clara simply nodded, her face impassive, and said, "Yes, Brenda." When Art had finished, he sat for a long time, just nursing his glass of water. Finally, he signaled for the check. Clara brought it over with a small, encouraging smile. "No rush at all," she said. He nodded and reached into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He patted his front pockets, then his back pockets. A look of confusion crossed his face, which quickly morphed into panic. He started searching more frantically, his breathing becoming shallow. "Is everything all right?" Clara asked, her smile fading into concern. "My wallet." He stammered, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "It's gone. It must have been stolen on the bus. I don't have any money. I can't pay." He looked utterly mortified, his face pale under his weathered skin. He started to rise as if to flee. "I'm so sorry, This was the moment of truth. Company policy was crystal clear, drilled into them by Brenda, and reinforced in training manuals from Kensington Eatery's headquarters. If a customer cannot pay you, do not engage. You do not make a scene. You signal the manager immediately. Brenda would then call security or the police, depending on the situation. It was a zero-tolerance policy designed to prevent theft and protect the company's assets. Clara looked at the terrified man in front of her. Then she glanced across the diner at Brenda, who was already watching them. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She knew what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to raise her hand, call Brenda over, and let the cold, impersonal gears of corporate policy grind this poor man into dust over a $5 bowl of stew. She thought of Leo. She thought of the overdue medical bill. She thought of her precarious financial situation and how desperately she needed this job. Losing it would be catastrophic. Then she looked back at Art, at the sheer soul-crushing humiliation in his eyes. And in that moment, her own struggles didn't make her harder. They made her softer. She understood desperation. She understood what it felt like to be one unlucky break away from disaster. Making a split-second decision that would alter the course of her life, she gave him a reassuring look and placed a hand gently on his arm. "Don't worry about it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay here. Please, don't move." Before the man could protest, she walked away from the table, not towards Brenda, but towards the small hidden pocket in her apron where she kept her day's tips. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to follow the rules to protect herself and her son. But the image of the man's panicked face was seared into her mind. She fumbled in her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the small, crumpled wad of bills she had earned so far. A 10 3-1s and a handful of change. $13 and some cents. It was her gas money, her grocery money, her just-in-case Leo's inhaler runs out money. It was everything. With trembling hands, she smoothed out a $5 bill and 2 ones. The check was for $5, plus tax, totaling $5,045. She would use her own money, ring it up as a cash payment, and Brenda would be none the wiser. The man could leave without the humiliation of a police escort, and she could keep the job she so desperately needed. It felt like a simple, elegant, and compassionate solution. She walked to the point-of-sale terminal at the waitstaff station, her back to Brenda. She quickly typed in the table number and selected the cash payment option. Her hands were sweating as she opened the cash drawer to deposit the money. "What are you doing, Miller?" The voice was ice-cold right behind her. Clara froze her hand, still inside the cash drawer. She slowly turned to face Brenda Vance. The manager's face was a thunderous mask. Her eyes narrowed to slits. I was just cashing out table 7. Clara stammered, trying to sound casual. "With what money?" Brenda's voice was dangerously low. "I've been watching you. That man told you he couldn't pay. I saw it on his face. And you did not signal for a manager, as per protocol." Clara's mind raced. He found the money. It was in a different pocket. It was a weak lie, and it crumbled instantly under Brenda's intense glare. "Open your hand," Brenda commanded. Clara hesitated. "Brenda, it's really—" "Now, Miller, or I'll have security do it for you." Defeated, Clara opened her hand, revealing her own crumpled bills. Brenda's eyes flickered from the money in Clara's palm to the cash drawer and back again. A slow, cruel smile of triumph spread across her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A clear, undeniable breach of Wallacey. "So this is how it is," Brenda said, her voice now rising in volume, attracting the attention of nearby staff and customers. "You are using your own funds to pay for a customer's meal. An unauthorized transaction. A flagrant violation of Kensington Eateries Policy 7B, subsection 4. Employee funds shall not be commingled with company revenue or used to settle a customer's bill under any circumstances." She recited the rule like a religious zealot quoting scripture. The diner was growing quiet. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation began to fade as people turned to watch the unfolding drama. At table 7, Art looked on his face a mixture of horror and disbelief. He started to get up to say something, but a subtle shake of Clara's head begged him to stay put. Intervening now would only make it worse. "He was hungry, Brenda." Clara pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. "He didn't have any money. It was $5. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops on him for a bowl of stew? You were supposed to follow procedure." Brenda snapped her voice, now a full-blown declaration for the entire room to hear. "Procedures exist for a reason. To protect this business. What happens next time? Do you give away a steak dinner? Do you start emptying the register for every sob story that walks in that door? You are not just an employee, Miller. You are a liability." The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on Clara, making it hard to breathe. Her cheeks burned. She could feel the pitying stares from her co-workers and the curious, judgmental gazes from the customers. "I paid for it," Clara said, her voice trembling but defiant. "The company didn't lose a single cent. In fact, you made a profit on the stew." This was the wrong thing to say. Brenda's face contorted with rage. "This isn't about one bowl of stew. It's about authority. It's about discipline. It's about the precedent you are setting. You have undermined my authority and willfully disregarded corporate policy. You have proven that you cannot be trusted." Brenda took a step back, her posture rigid and official. She was no longer a diner manager. She was an executioner. "Clara Miller," she announced, her voice ringing with a cold finality that chilled Clara to the bone. "As of this moment, your employment with Kensington Eateries is terminated. You are fired." The word hung in the air, sharp and brutal. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Maria had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Even the cooks had stopped working and were staring out from the kitchen pass-through. "Brenda, you can't—" Clara choked out, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, my son, I need this job." "You should have thought of your son before you decided to become a martyr for a vagrant," Brenda retorted coldly. "Take off your apron. I'll have your final paycheck mailed to you. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal belongings from your locker. I will escort you out myself." Numbly, Clara untied the strings of her apron. The cheap yellow fabric suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She folded it and placed it on the counter. The tears that she had been holding back now streamed freely down her face. She looked past Brenda, her gaze landing on table 7. The man Art was standing now, his face pale, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to speak, to scream, to tear the whole place down. But what could he do? He was a nobody, a homeless man who had inadvertently cost a kind woman her livelihood. Their eyes met one last time, and in his she saw a look of profound, agonizing regret. As Brenda marched her towards the staff lockers, the silence of the diner was broken by the sound of a chair scraping back and a heavy, intentional clatter. Someone had left a $20 bill on table 7, right next to the half-empty glass of water. But it was too late. The gears had been set in motion, and Clara Miller, mother, waitress, and good Samaritan, was now unemployed. The walk home was a blur. Clara didn't remember the familiar route, the crack in the sidewalk on the corner of Elm and 3rd, or the sound of the elevated train rattling overhead. All she could feel was the phantom weight of the apron on her waist, and the searing heat of humiliation on her cheeks. The city sounds were muffled, as if she were underwater, drowning in a sea of despair. When she reached her apartment building, the 3 flights of stairs felt like a mountain. Each step was a leaden weight, her legs trembling with a combination of exhaustion and shock. The key fumbled in the lock, her hands shaking too much to guide it home. Finally, the door clicked open, and she stepped into the silence of her empty apartment. For a moment, she just stood there in the small entryway, her purse sliding from her shoulder and landing on the floor with a soft thud. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Fired. The word echoed in the silent apartment, mocking her. Fired for a $5 bowl of stew. Fired for being kind. She sank onto her worn-out sofa, the springs groaning in protest. She didn't cry. The tears had run dry on the walk home, leaving behind a hollow, aching numbness. Her mind, however, was a chaotic storm. How was she going to pay rent next month? The landlord, Mr. Petrov, was a stickler. He didn't do extensions. How would she afford Leo's medication? His new prescription was waiting at the pharmacy, its cost looming like a monster in the dark. What about food? The fridge was already looking bare. Panic began to claw its way up her throat, cold and sharp. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her crumbling world together. She was a good worker. She was never late. She covered shifts for others. She did everything that was asked of her, and more. How could it all be undone by one small act of compassion? Her eyes fell on a framed photograph on the end table. It was of her and her late husband, David, taken 5 years ago on a rare trip to the lake. They were smiling, their faces bright with a future that had seemed so full of promise. David had been a chef, a man who believed that food was love. He would have been proud of what she did today. "You always feed a hungry man, Clara," he used to say. "No questions asked. That's the first rule of the kitchen." David had also worked for a Kensington eateries establishment, a more upscale bistro downtown. He'd been passionate, creative, a rising star in the kitchen. Then one night, he'd been fired. The official reason was unauthorized use of company inventory. He had made a beautiful birthday cake for a dishwasher whose family couldn't afford one, using a handful of flour, sugar, and eggs from the pantry. He was fired on the spot by a manager just like Brenda, a man who saw only inventory shrinkage, not a gesture of human decency. The dismissal had broken David's spirit. He struggled to find another job with that mark on his record. The stress, the shame. It led him down a dark path. A year later, he was gone, leaving Clara alone with a 2-year-old Leo and a mountain of grief. The bitter irony was not lost on her. The same corporation, with its same soulless, rigid policies, had now shattered her life just as it had shattered his. It was a cruel repeating pattern, a legacy of corporate indifference that had claimed her family twice. A wave of anger, hot and fierce, finally broke through the numbness. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about David. It was about every little person ground up by the unfeeling machinery of a giant company that valued rules over people. Getting up from the couch, she walked to Leo's room. He was still at Mrs. Gable's. She would have to call and tell her she couldn't afford to pay her for the rest of the week. Her son was sleeping soundly in his small bed, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The nebulizer stood guard on his nightstand. She reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. He was her whole world. Everything she did for him. And now she had failed him. That was the thought that finally broke her. The tears came again, silent and agonizing. She sank to the floor, her head resting against the side of his bed, and wept. She wept for her lost job, for her shattered pride, for the uncertain future. She wept for David and the life they were supposed to have. She wept for the simple, crushing unfairness of it all. As the evening light faded outside the window, casting long shadows across the room, Clara Miller felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. She had never felt so utterly and completely alone in the dark. While Clara's world was shrinking to the four walls of her silent apartment, another world, one of panoramic city views and polished mahogany, was being shaken to its core. Arthur Kensington, known to Clara only as Art, sat in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, the scent of rich leather, a stark, nauseating contrast to the diner's lingering smell of grease and despair. He had shed the ragged clothes now stuffed in a duffel bag on the floor, and was back in a tailored Brioni suit. But the transformation was only skin deep. Inside he was still the man from Table 7, horrified, ashamed, and powerless. He hadn't intervened. That was the thought that played on a torturous loop in his mind. He, Arthur Kensington, CEO and chairman of Kensington Eateries, Inc., a man whose single word could create or destroy careers, had sat by and watched a good woman be publicly humiliated and fired for showing him a kindness he hadn't experienced in years. He had stayed in character, played the part of the helpless vagrant, because his undercover CEO consultants had told him that intervention would compromise the entire project. "Observe and report, Mr. Kensington. Do not engage." What a fool he'd been. This whole exercise, cooked up by his PR team, was supposed to be a way to reconnect with the company his father had built. "See the front lines, Art," his father had always said. "A company's heart isn't in the boardroom, it's on the diner floor." After his father's death 6 months ago, Arthur, who had been raised on spreadsheets and profit margins, felt a gnawing disconnect from that philosophy. He agreed to the undercover stunt, expecting to find inefficiency, maybe some minor theft, things he could fix with a memo and a new set of policies. Instead, he found Clara. And he found Brenda. He had witnessed firsthand the brutal manifestation of the very corporate culture he had fostered. Brenda wasn't a monster. She was a product. She was the perfect manager by his company's standards. She quoted policy-maximized profit and eliminated inefficiencies. And Clara, with her boundless empathy, was the inefficiency she had eliminated. The car pulled up to the gleaming Kensington Tower, a monument of glass and steel that suddenly felt like a tomb. In his penthouse office on the 80th floor, the city lights spread out below him like a blanket of scattered jewels. He had always found this view inspiring, a symbol of his power and success. Tonight, it just made him feel small and isolated. "Get me Mark Renshaw on the line. Now," he barked at his assistant through the intercom. "And pull the complete employee file for a waitress named Clara Miller from the Golden Spoon Diner on North Clark Street. And while you're at it, get me the file for the manager, Brenda Vance. He paced the length of his office, the plush carpet muffling his angry footsteps. He had seen the fear in Clara's eyes when she pleaded for her job, mentioning her son. He had created a system where a mother's livelihood could be extinguished over 545 falls. The thought was sickening. His assistant buzzed back. "Mr. Renshaw is on line 1, sir, and the files have been sent to your secure tablet." Arthur snatched the phone. "Mark," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Arthur Kensington. I was reviewing the performance metrics for the North Clark Street diner. Tell me about the manager, Brenda Vance." Renshaw, clearly caught off guard by a direct call from the CEO, stammered for a moment. "Mr. Kensington, sir, Brenda Vance is an exemplary manager, a real bulldog. She has the highest profit margins in my district. Table turn times are down 15%, and upsells are up 20% since she took over." "And her staff turnover rate?" Arthur asked, his eyes cold. There was a pause. "Well, sir, that is slightly higher than average. But in this industry, slightly higher—" Arthur cut him off, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm looking at the numbers right here, Mark. It's the highest in the entire Midwest region. She churns through employees like they're disposable napkins. Do you reward that?" "Her results speak for themselves, sir," Renshaw said defensively. "She's a bottom-line manager. That's what we've been incentivizing." "We've been incentivizing." The words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. Renshaw was right. The problem wasn't just Brenda or Mark. The problem was him. "We're going to talk more about your incentive programs tomorrow, Mark. Be in my office at 8 a.m., Arthur said, and hung up before Renshaw could reply. He picked up his tablet and opened Clara Miller's file. It was sparse. Hired 3 years ago. No commendations, no demerits. Just a steady, unremarkable record. He saw her address, her emergency contact information, and a note about her dependent son, Leo. Then he swiped to the next page to her personal information. He saw her last name, Miller, and next to it, the name of her late husband listed as her former next of kin, David Miller. Arthur's blood ran cold. David Miller. The name echoed from the past. He quickly accessed the company's terminated employee archives, his fingers flying across the screen. He typed in the name. One result. David Miller, former line chef, terminated 5 years ago from the Kensington Grill. Arthur remembered the incident vaguely. A regional manager, a different one, had boasted about it in a quarterly meeting, making an example of a chef who had been caught giving away inventory. They had all nodded along, praising the manager's firm hand in protecting company assets. He looked back at Clara's file, then at David's. It was the same address. He stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a ghost of his company's past, a direct consequence of a culture he had helped build and perpetuate, coming back to haunt him. He had not just witnessed an injustice, he had participated in the second act of a tragedy his own company had written. The view from his window suddenly seemed to mock him. He had built an empire on a foundation of cold, hard numbers, and in the process he had crushed the lives of real people. People like David. People like Clara. A profound, soul-deep shame washed over him, followed by a white-hot resolve. This was not something a memo could fix. This required more than a policy change. This required a reckoning. He buzzed his assistant again, his voice now steady and imbued with a commanding clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Cancel my 8 a.m. meeting with Mark Renshaw," he said. "Clear my entire morning schedule, and have my car ready at 7:30 a.m. I'm going back to the Golden Spoon Diner." The next morning, the Golden Spoon Diner was operating with a nervous, subdued energy. Clara's absence was a palpable void. The staff moved with a hesitant caution, every action performed under the shadow of the previous day's brutal firing. Brenda Vance patrolled the floor like a victorious general, her posture even more rigid than usual, her presence a clear warning to anyone else considering stepping out of line. She was sipping her coffee near the register when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, a formulaic "Welcome to the Golden Spoon" dying on her lips. Standing in the doorway was not a regular customer. It was a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. He was flanked by two other people, a man and a woman, both impeccably dressed and holding portfolios. The man in the suit was tall, with an air of absolute unshakable authority. His clear blue eyes swept across the diner, taking in every detail. They were the same intelligent blue eyes Brenda had seen in The Ragged Vagrant the day before. Her brain struggled to connect the two images. It was impossible. She blinked, but he was still there now, walking slowly toward her. "Good morning, Aku," the man said, his voice calm but resonant with power. It was the same voice, no longer raspy, but smooth and commanding. "I believe we met yesterday. You, however, met Art. My name is Arthur Kensington." Brenda's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and splashing hot liquid across her sensible shoes. She didn't even notice. The name echoed in her ears, Kensington, as in Kensington Eateries. The staff behind the counter froze. The low chatter of the few morning customers died away. Mr. Kensington," she stammered, her face draining of all colour. I had no idea. Sir, it's an honour. I didn't recognise you." "That was the point," Arthur said coolly, his gaze unwavering. "I came to see my company from the perspective of a customer, or in my case, from the perspective of a man with nothing. And what I saw was illuminating." He gestured to the two people with him. "This is Elizabeth Shaw, my head of human resources, and this is Michael Chen from my legal department. We're here to conduct an immediate and thorough operational review." He then turned his attention to the rest of the stunned staff. "I would like to assure you all that your jobs are safe. We are here to fix what is broken, not to punish those who have been forced to work within a broken system." His gaze landed back on Brenda, and all warmth vanished from his eyes. "I saw a manager who prioritizes policies over people, who values a $5 transaction over human dignity, and who fires a dedicated, compassionate employee without a moment's hesitation to enforce a soulless rule." Brenda was trembling now, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. "Sir, I was just following procedure. The company handbook, I'm well aware of what the handbook says." Arthur interrupted, his voice sharp as glass. "I signed off on it, and I have never been more ashamed of my own signature. You did exactly what the system I created taught you to do, and that is the problem." He turned to his HR head. "Elizabeth, I want you to begin one-on-one interviews with every employee here. I want to know everything. Unfiltered, unedited. I want to know about their struggles, their fears, their ideas." Then he pulled out his personal phone. He scrolled through a contact and pressed call. He put it on speaker for Brenda to hear. After 2 rings, a weary, grief-stricken voice answered. "Hello, Clara Miller?" Arthur asked, his own voice softening considerably. There was a pause. Yes? Who is this? My name is Arthur Kensington. You helped me yesterday at the diner. I was the man at table 7. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with confusion and disbelief. I don't understand. I know you don't, and I am so profoundly sorry for what happened to you, more sorry than I can possibly put into words. What you did was the kindest, most decent thing I have seen in a very long time, and you were punished for it. That ends today. He took a deep breath. Clara, I need to ask you to come back to the diner. Right now. There's something we need to discuss in person. It's important. It's about your husband, David. At the mention of David's name, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Brenda's eyes went wide. She knew about David Miller's firing. It was a legendary story among Kensington managers, an example of how to maintain standards. The full, horrifying scope of the situation was finally dawning on her. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Clara said, her voice no longer weary, but filled with a new, sharp and uncertain intensity. Arthur ended the call and looked at Brenda, whose face was now a pale, ghostly white. The woman you fired yesterday, Arthur said, his voice low and heavy with meaning, was the widow of a man our company already failed once. You didn't just fire a waitress, you repeated history, and I was there to witness the whole shameful cycle. Now we are all going to sit here and wait for her to arrive, and we are going to begin to make it right. Clara walked into the Golden Spoon diner like a person entering a dream. The 20-minute taxi ride paid for by the car service Arthur Kensington had sent had done little to prepare her for the scene inside. Her former co-workers were gathered in small, hushed groups. Her former manager, Brenda Vance, was sitting stiffly at a table, pale and silent. And in the center of it all stood the man from table 7, no longer Art the vagrant, but Arthur Kensington, the CEO, his powerful presence commanding the entire room. He turned as she entered, and the look on his face was one of deep, undisguised remorse. He walked toward her, meeting her in the middle of the diner floor. "Clara," he began, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Thank you for coming. First, before anything else, I want to apologize. What happened to you yesterday was an unforgivable failure on my part, and on the part of the company I lead. There is no excuse." Clara was still trying to process the sheer surreality of it all. You're the CEO. She stated the words, feeling foreign in her mouth. "I am," he confirmed, "and I have been a very poor one. I lost sight of what my father built this company on people. You reminded me of that, your compassion, your integrity, even when it cost you everything. That is the core of what this business should be." He gestured to an empty booth. "Please, sit with me." Hesitantly, she slid into the booth, and he sat opposite her. For the first time, she wasn't his waitress. They were equals. "When I looked at your employee file," he continued gently, "I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Your husband's name. David Miller. I remembered his case." Clara stiffened old wounds, reopening with a fresh, sharp pain. "You fired him for giving a birthday cake to a man who had nothing." Arthur didn't flinch from her accusatory gaze. He met it head-on. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with regret. "We did. It was a decision made by a regional manager, but I was the CEO. I endorsed the culture that allowed it to happen. A culture that prized a few dollars worth of flour and sugar over a man's dignity and career. I see now with a clarity that sickens me that David's firing wasn't just a mistake. It was a moral failing, a failing that I believe contributed to what happened to him. and for that, I am truly, deeply sorry." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of validation of a long-held pain finally being acknowledged. "Clara, I cannot undo the past," Arthur said, leaning forward, his voice earnest. "I cannot bring David back, but I can promise you starting today that his legacy and your act of kindness will become the catalyst for a fundamental change in this entire corporation." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I didn't come here just to offer you your job back. Frankly, you deserve better than that. I am creating a new position, a new department within Kensington Eateries. It's called the Kensington Cares Initiative. Its sole purpose will be to audit and reform our company policies, to implement employee support programs, and to ensure that compassion and empathy are woven into the very fabric of how we do business. We'll establish emergency funds for employees, in crisis overhaul our management training, and create pathways for real feedback from the ground up." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a desperate hope. "And I want you to run it. I want you to be its first ever director. I don't want someone with a business degree who's never served a plate of food in their life. I want someone who understands the human cost of a bad policy. I want someone with integrity, with courage, and with a heart. I want you, Clara." Clara was speechless, the director of a corporate initiative. It was unfathomable. "Me, I'm a waitress. I don't know how to run a department." "You know how to be a decent human being," Arthur countered. "That's the most important qualification. We will provide you with all the training resources and support you need. A team, an office at headquarters, and a salary that will ensure you and Leo never have to worry about a medical bill or the rent again. I'm not offering you a job, Clara. I'm asking you to be my partner in fixing this company, to help me build a corporation that David would have been proud to work for." Across the room, Brenda Vance watched this exchange, her face a complicated mask of shock, shame, and perhaps for the first time, a glimmer of understanding. Her world of rigid rules and cold metrics had been turned upside down by a single act of kindness she had tried to stamp out. Clara looked at Arthur Kensington, the man she had fed when he was hungry. She thought of Leo, of David, of the endless, exhausting struggle. And for the first time in years, she saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Not just an escape from her circumstances, but a chance to build something better, to give meaning to her own suffering and to David's memory. A slow, tentative smile touched her lips. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, I'll do it." Arthur Kensington let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was the beginning of a long road, but it was a start. The Golden Spoon Diner, once the scene of a cruel injustice, had just become the birthplace of a revolution, all because one waitress chose kindness over policy, and one CEO was finally willing to see the human beings behind his bottom line. The story of Clara Miller and Arthur Kensington isn't just about a job lost and a fortune gained. It's a powerful reminder that our true character is revealed not in how we follow the rules, but in how we treat each other, especially when no one is watching. Clara's simple act of kindness, born from her own struggles, created a ripple that didn't just come back to her. It grew into a tidal wave of change that reformed an entire company. It proves that one person armed with empathy can be more powerful than the most rigid corporate policy. Her story teaches us that true strength lies in compassion, and that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most profound rewards. What seems like a thankless sacrifice could be the very thing that changes everything. If Clara's incredible journey moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to spread the message of kindness. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And for more real-life stories that will inspire and amaze you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.
The millionaire CEO laughed. If she plays piano, I'll marry her. But when the 22-year-old waitress touched the keys, the entire restaurant froze in disbelief. Follow our channel and hit the like button to support these emotional stories. Your engagement helps us bring more touching moments to life. Now let's dive in. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast golden shadows across the marble floors as Alexander Sterling adjusted his Armani suit and surveyed the elegant dining room with the practiced eye of someone who owned half of Manhattan's most exclusive establishments. At 34, he commanded boardrooms with the same ruthless precision he used to dissect a perfectly prepared Dover sole. His dark hair was styled to perfection, his steel-grey eyes calculating every detail of the room, from the imported Italian tablecloths to the worth of each patron's jewelry. Another champagne, Mr. Sterling? The sommelier approached with reverent deference, recognizing one of New York's most formidable business titans. Alexander nodded curtly, his attention already shifting to the quarterly reports displayed on his phone screen. Sterling Industries had just closed a $3 billion merger, yet here he sat, obligated to attend his business partner's anniversary dinner when he could be strategizing their next acquisition. "Alexander, you're being antisocial again," chided Victoria Ashworth, sliding into the chair beside him. Her red Valentino dress probably cost more than most people's cars, and her smile held the calculated warmth of someone who'd been raised in Manhattan's social elite. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "I celebrate by making money, Victoria. This," he gestured around the opulent restaurant, "is a waste of time that could be better spent preparing for the Hartwell acquisition." Victoria laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes. "You know what your problem is. You've forgotten how to have fun. When was the last time you did something spontaneous?" Before Alexander could respond with his usual cutting remark about spontaneity being the enemy of success, a young woman appeared at their table. She moved with quiet grace despite carrying a heavily loaded tray, her long auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her green eyes more striking. The black uniform of the restaurant's waitstaff couldn't disguise her natural elegance, though Alexander barely glanced up from his phone. "Good evening. I'm Emma, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested exhaustion. "Can I start you with any appetizers?" Victoria ordered, with the casual extravagance of someone who'd never checked a price, while Alexander continued scrolling through emails. When Emma turned to him expectantly, he finally looked up, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, a recognition of intelligence in her eyes that seemed out of place for a waitress in even the finest establishment. "The usual," he said dismissively, returning to his phone. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what your usual order is. This is my first evening serving your section." The slight sharpness in her tone made Alexander look up again, this time with the focused attention he usually reserved for boardroom adversaries. There was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that refused to be diminished by his condescension. "Oysters Rockefeller, the Wagyu beef, medium rare and whatever wine pairs best," he said, his voice carrying the impatience of someone unaccustomed to repeating himself. "Excellent choice." "The 2015 Bordeaux would complement the Wagyu beautifully," Emma replied, and Alexander caught the subtle note of knowledge in her recommendation, knowledge that went beyond standard server training. As she walked away, Victoria leaned closer. "She's pretty." "She's the help," Alexander replied, though his eyes followed Emma's retreating figure longer than he cared to admit. The evening progressed with typical Manhattan social theater, discussions of real estate prices, complaints about the mayor's policies, and gossip about which socialite was divorcing which hedge fund prince. Alexander participated with half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on quarterly projections, until Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm. "Oh my God, Alexander, look!" She pointed toward the restaurant's grand piano, where the evening's scheduled pianist, a distinguished older gentleman, was being helped to a chair by concerned staff members. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the maitre d', his French accent thick with concern, "I'm afraid Monsieur Dubois has taken ill and will be unable to perform this evening. We sincerely apologize for any disappointment." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the dining room. The piano was a centerpiece of Le Bernardin's ambiance, its nightly performances as essential as the expertly prepared cuisine. Alexander saw an opportunity for entertainment in the disruption. The champagne had loosened his tongue, and Victoria's earlier comment about spontaneity had touched a nerve. He stood commanding attention with the natural authority that came from owning buildings taller than most people's ambitions. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily across the restaurant, "I have a proposition that might salvage our evening's entertainment." All eyes turned to him, including Emma's, who had been clearing a nearby table. Alexander's gaze found hers and held it, a predatory smile spreading across his handsome features. "I'll bet anyone in this room that our charming waitress here," he gestured toward Emma, who had gone completely still, "can't play a single piece on that piano with any degree of competence. In fact, I'm so confident in this assessment that I'll make an outrageous wager." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or disaster. Emma's face had gone pale, but her green eyes blazed with something that might have been fury or determination. "What kind of wager, Mr. Sterling?" The use of his name surprised him. She'd been listening, learning, cataloguing information like any good intelligence gatherer. "Interesting. If you can play any classical piece with the skill of a trained musician, really play, not just stumble through chopsticks, I'll marry you." The words came out before his rational mind could stop them, fueled by champagne and the absolute certainty that a waitress couldn't possibly possess such skills. Victoria gasped. "Alexander, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," he replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Of course, when you inevitably fail, you'll quit this job tonight and never work in any establishment I frequent again. Fair enough?" The cruelty of the wager wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Alexander Sterling could destroy a service worker's career in Manhattan with a single phone call, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just a bet, it was a public humiliation designed to amuse a bored billionaire. Emma stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made Alexander's smug confidence waver almost imperceptibly. "And if I win, you'll honor your word? You'll actually marry me?" "I'm a man of my word in business," Alexander replied, though something in Emma's tone made him suddenly wish he'd ordered another bottle of wine instead of making foolish bets. Emma walked toward the piano with measured steps, her posture straightening with each stride. As she passed tables of Manhattan's elite, whispers followed in her wake. Some diners had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be either spectacular failure or social media gold. She sat at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment that stretched into eternity. When she finally placed her hands on the keyboard, something extraordinary happened. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant with crystalline perfection. Not the simple melody, but the full, complex arrangement that required years of classical training to master. Emma's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, her entire body swaying with the music, as if she and the piano were old lovers reunited after a long separation. The technical difficulty of the piece was staggering: rapid scales, complex harmonies, and emotional passages that required not just skill but deep musical understanding. Emma played it flawlessly, her face transformed by concentration and something deeper, something that looked like pain being channeled into beauty. Alexander's smug smile had vanished completely. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand as he watched this waitress, this woman he'd dismissed as the help, perform with the skill of a conservatory graduate. Around the restaurant, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. When Emma reached the concerto's most technically challenging passage, a section that separated amateur pianists from true artists, she didn't just survive it, she soared. Her left hand maintained the complex bass line, while her right hand danced through intricate melodies with a precision that would have impressed Carnegie Hall audiences. The final notes lingered in the air like a blessing, and for several heartbeats no one moved. Then applause erupted, genuine and thunderous, from every corner of the restaurant. Several women were crying, and even the hardened maitre d' was wiping his eyes. Emma stood slowly, her hands shaking now from more than just nerves. She looked directly at Alexander, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tight. Not triumph, but a profound sadness, mixed with steely determination. "I believe you owe me a wedding, Mr. Sterling." Alexander Sterling had built his empire by never showing weakness, but as he stared at Emma across the now silent restaurant, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete uncertainty. The woman standing by the piano wasn't the simple waitress he'd mockingly challenged. The skill she'd just demonstrated represented years of elite musical training, the kind that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "That was," Victoria whispered beside him, but her words trailed off as she processed the implications of what they'd all witnessed. Alexander's business instincts kicked in, searching for an escape clause, a technicality that could void his impulsive wager. But he'd made the bet publicly, in front of Manhattan's social elite, many of whom were already recording the aftermath on their phones. His reputation for being a man of his word in business deals was the foundation of his success. He couldn't simply walk away from this without destroying his credibility. Emma began walking back toward their table, her movements controlled but graceful. As she approached, Alexander noticed details he'd missed before. The way she carried herself with natural poise despite wearing a server's uniform, the intelligence in her green eyes that suggested depths he hadn't bothered to explore, and something else, a wariness that spoke of experience with disappointment. "Well," she said quietly when she reached his table, "are you a man of your word, or just another rich man who thinks promises are for other people?" The challenge in her voice sparked something competitive in Alexander's nature. He stood, matching her height in her comfortable flats to his expensive Italian shoes. "I made a public wager, and you fulfilled your end admirably. But surely you don't expect me to actually marry someone I've known for all of 30 minutes. I expect you to honor your commitment, Mr. Sterling. You made the terms quite clear. If I could play classical music with the skill of a trained musician, you'd marry me." I held up my end of the bargain, Victoria gasped. "Emma, you can't be serious. You don't actually want to marry him." Emma's smile held no warmth. "Oh, but I am serious. Deadly serious." Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger desperation or social climbing ambition. Instead, he found something far more complex, determination mixed with what looked suspiciously like hurt pride and carefully controlled anger. "You're calling in the debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to the low tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "I'm collecting on a promise. There's a difference." The surrounding diners were still watching, phones still recording, social media posts already being crafted about the most outrageous bet in Manhattan's social history. Alexander realized he was trapped by his own arrogance and the very public nature of his foolish wager. "Fine," he said, his jaw tight, "but we'll do this properly. A real engagement, a proper wedding. If I'm going to honor this ridiculous bet, we'll do it right." Emma's composure flickered for just a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to actually agree. "How properly?" 6 months engagement minimum. You'll move into my penthouse. We'll attend social functions together. And you'll learn what it means to be married to someone in my position. If after 6 months you still want to go through with this insanity, we'll have a wedding that won't embarrass either of us. And if I change my mind during those 6 months, Alexander's smile was sharp, then you walk away with nothing, having proven that this was just an elaborate gold-digger scheme. The insult hit its mark. Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not a gold-digger, Mr. Sterling. I'm a woman who believes people should keep their promises." "We'll see," he replied coolly. Then louder for the benefit of their audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears I'm engaged." The restaurant erupted in surprised chatter and congratulations that ranged from genuine to clearly fake. Victoria looked stunned, while Emma appeared to be questioning her own sanity. As the evening wound down and other diners began to leave, many stopping to congratulate the unlikely couple, Alexander found himself alone with Emma by the piano. The restaurant staff was giving them space, though he caught them whispering and stealing glances. "So, he said, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. "I suppose we should discuss practical arrangements. Do you have somewhere to live currently?" "A small apartment in Queens," Emma replied, her voice careful and neutral. "You'll need to give notice immediately. I'll have my assistant arrange for your belongings to be moved to my penthouse. We'll need to shop for appropriate clothing. My fiancé can't be seen in." He gestured vaguely at her server's uniform. Emma's eyes flashed dangerously. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, Mr. Sterling. And there's nothing wrong with my clothes outside of this uniform." "Of course not," he said quickly, recognizing he'd stumbled into dangerous territory. "I simply meant that as my fiancé, you'll be attending events that have certain expectations about attire. Designer gowns and jewelry worth more than some people's houses?" "Exactly." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Can I ask you something?" "What? Why did you make that bet? Really? Was it just cruelty for entertainment, or was there something else?" The question caught Alexander off guard with its directness. He found himself actually considering it seriously, instead of deflecting with his usual sarcasm. "Honestly, you intrigued me," he admitted. "There was something about the way you carried yourself, the way you recommended that wine. You didn't seem like just a waitress, but I couldn't figure out what you were hiding. The bet was crude curiosity, I suppose." "And what do you think now that you know I can play piano?" Alexander looked at her carefully. "Now I think you're hiding much more than I initially suspected. The question is whether that makes you more interesting or more dangerous." Emma's laugh held no humor. "I suppose you'll find out during our 6-month engagement, won't you?" "I suppose I will." He paused, then asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" That wasn't amateur hour talent. For the first time since the bet began, Emma's composure cracked slightly. Pain flashed across her features before she controlled it. "That's a story for another day, Mr. Sterling." "Alexander," he corrected automatically. "If we're going to be engaged, you should use my first name." "Alexander," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his name sound different, more personal. "And you should know I'm not doing this for your money. I have my own reasons for accepting this arrangement." "What reasons?" Emma gathered her purse and the light jacket she'd worn to work. "Like I said, that's a story for another day. But Alexander, you might want to have your assistant research the name Emma Blackwood before I move into your penthouse." She walked away, leaving Alexander standing by the piano with the distinct feeling that he'd just agreed to far more than a simple business arrangement. The name Blackwood tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. As he watched Emma disappear into the Manhattan night, Alexander Sterling, who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer or a problem he couldn't solve with money, realized he might have finally bitten off more than he could chew, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow would bring. Alexander's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Sterling Tower, a testament to both his success and his need to remain above the city he'd conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, while the interior design spoke of refined taste and unlimited budgets. As he waited for Emma to arrive with her belongings, he found himself unusually restless. His assistant, Margaret Chen, had delivered the research he'd requested on Emma Blackwood with her typical efficiency, but the file she'd placed on his mahogany desk remained unopened. Some instinct told him he should hear Emma's story from her own lips, rather than read it in a cold investigative report. The elevator chimed, and Emma stepped into his private foyer, carrying 2 modest suitcases and a worn leather messenger bag. She'd traded her server's uniform for dark jeans and a cream silk blouse that suggested she owned better clothes than he'd assumed. Her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the harsh restaurant lighting, he could see that she was even more beautiful than he'd initially realized. "Impressive," she said, looking around the space with an appraising eye that suggested familiarity with luxury, rather than awe at experiencing it for the first time. "You don't seem surprised by the accommodations," Alexander observed. "I'm not," Emma replied simply, setting down her luggage. "I've seen places like this before." Another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the Waitress narrative. Alexander filed the information away and gestured toward the hallway. "The guest suite is down the hall. You'll have your own bathroom, walk-in closet and sitting area, complete privacy. Emma nodded. And what exactly do you expect from me during these 6 months? Public appearances as my fiancé. Social events, business dinners, charity galas. You'll need to be convincing in the role. My reputation depends on this looking legitimate. And privately? Alexander met her gaze directly. Privately, we're strangers who made a foolish bet. I won't pretend this is some romantic fairy tale, and I assume you're too intelligent to expect one. Emma's smile was enigmatic. You assume a great deal about what I expect, Alexander. She moved to the window, looking out over the city with an expression he couldn't read. In profile, with the afternoon light catching her features, she looked almost aristocratic, the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of breeding and privilege. Can I ask you something? She said without turning around. What? Do you remember the Blackwood Industries collapse 8 years ago? The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Suddenly he knew exactly why Blackwood had seemed familiar. The scandal had been front-page news for months, a family empire built over 4 generations, destroyed overnight by embezzlement charges and fraudulent accounting. The family had lost everything. Their fortune, their social standing, their reputation. You're not, he began, but Emma turned to face him, and her expression confirmed his suspicion. Emma Blackwood, former heiress to a $2 billion fortune, former member of New York's social elite, former student at Juilliard, where I was studying piano performance before my world imploded. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. Current waitress, former cleaning lady, former nanny, former whatever job I could get to survive. Alexander stared at her, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Your father was Jonathan Blackwood, the embezzlement scandal. My father was framed, Emma said quietly, by his business partner and best friend, who needed a scapegoat when their offshore accounts were discovered by federal investigators. But by the time the truth came out, Dad was already dead from a heart attack brought on by the stress and humiliation. The family name was destroyed, the money was gone, and I was 22 years old with a music degree and no practical skills for survival in the real world. The raw honesty in her voice made Alexander feel something unfamiliar, shame at his earlier dismissiveness, and something deeper that might have been respect. Why didn't you tell me this at the restaurant? Emma laughed bitterly. And what would you have done? Probably offered me money out of pity and rescinded your bet. I didn't want your charity, Alexander. I wanted your pride to cost you something, the way it cost my family everything. So this is revenge. This is justice, Emma corrected. You made a bet designed to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you. Instead, you're going to learn what it's like to be bound by a commitment you can't buy your way out of. Alexander walked to his bar and poured himself a scotch, his mind racing. Emma Blackwood, he remembered her now from society pages, back when she'd been a promising young pianist and a fixture at Manhattan charity events. The transformation from privileged socialite to service worker must have been devastating. The piano skills, he said, understanding flooding through him. 12 years of training at the finest conservatories money could buy. I was scheduled to perform with the New York Philharmonic the month after my world collapsed. Instead, I spent that month learning how to clean office buildings for minimum wage. Alexander downed his scotch, the burn helping him process this revelation. Why take the bet, Emma? You could have just let me make a fool of myself and walked away. Emma moved closer, and he could smell her perfume. Something subtle and expensive that suggested old money rather than new wealth. Because I've spent 8 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human by people who used to bow and scrape for my family's approval. Last night you looked at me the way they all do, as if I was nothing, and I realized I was tired of being nothing. So you decided to become my fiancé. I decided to remind a certain arrogant CEO that actions have consequences, even for men who think they're untouchable. Alexander found himself oddly impressed by her strategic thinking. And what happens in 6 months when this engagement is supposed to end? What's your exit strategy? Emma's smile was mysterious. Who says I have one? The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger opportunism. but instead found something more complex: intelligence, determination, and what might have been genuine attraction beneath the calculated strategy. You're playing a dangerous game, Emma Blackwood. I learned from the best, she replied. 8 years in the service industry teaches you how to read people, how to anticipate their moves, how to survive in a world that wants to crush you. You may have built an empire, Alexander, but I've learned how to rise from the ashes of one. Alexander set down his empty glass, his business instincts warring with something else, and growing fascination with this woman who had turned his simple, cruel bet into something far more complex. "All right," he said finally. 6 months. But Emma, if you think you can play me the way those society vultures played your father, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't build Sterling Industries by being naive about people's motivations. Emma's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Oh, Alexander, if you think this is about money, you really don't understand what game we're playing." As she picked up her luggage and headed toward the guest suite, Alexander found himself watching her with new eyes. Emma Blackwood wasn't just beautiful or talented or mysterious. She was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the growing certainty that his carefully controlled life was about to become very, very complicated. And despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, he found himself looking forward to finding out exactly how complicated things were about to become. 3 weeks into their engagement, Alexander Sterling discovered that living with Emma Blackwood was like trying to contain lightning in a bottle. She moved through his penthouse with the unconscious grace of someone born to luxury, yet her sharp observations about his business dealings revealed an intelligence that constantly surprised him. What disturbed him most was how naturally she fit into his world, and how much he'd begun to look forward to their evening conversations over dinner. That illusion of harmony shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when Margaret Chen knocked on his office door with an expression that meant trouble. "Sir, there's a situation developing. Richard Hartwell is here with his legal team, and they're demanding an immediate meeting. They seem agitated." Alexander looked up from the merger documents spread across his desk. The Hartwell acquisition was the crown jewel of Sterling Industries' expansion plan, worth $4 billion and 18 months of careful negotiation. Richard Hartwell was old-money Manhattan aristocracy, the kind of man who viewed business as a gentleman's game with unwritten rules. "Send them in." Richard Hartwell entered with 2 lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit impeccable, but his usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled fury. "Alexander," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent romantic entanglement." Alexander's blood chilled. "I'm not sure what you mean, Richard. Don't insult my intelligence." Hartwell dropped a manila folder on the desk. "Emma Blackwood, the fallen heiress you're parading around as your fiancée. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the woman who's suddenly appeared in your life just as we're finalizing the largest merger in both our companies' histories?" Alexander opened the folder with steady hands, though his pulse was racing. Inside were photographs of Emma at charity events from 8 years ago, newspaper clippings about the Blackwood family scandal, and recent paparazzi shots of her and Alexander at a gallery opening the previous week. "This is irrelevant to our business dealings," Alexander said carefully. Hartwell's laugh was cold. "Irrelevant? Alexander, I'm about to merge my family's century-old company with yours. That requires absolute trust, complete confidence in your judgment, and you've just proven that your judgment is catastrophically compromised." "How exactly have I done that?" "By allowing yourself to be seduced by a gold digger with revenge fantasies. Do you have any idea what Emma Blackwood's real agenda might be? Her father's business partner, the man who supposedly framed Jonathan Blackwood, was my cousin, David Hartwell." Alexander felt the floor drop out from under him. David Hartwell had been found dead in his Swiss chalet 2 years ago, an apparent suicide after years of guilt over the Blackwood scandal. The case had been closed with his death, all questions answered, all blame assigned. "I see you're beginning to understand," Richard continued ruthlessly. "Emma Blackwood has every reason to hate my family, and by extension anyone associated with us. What better way to destroy the Hartwell-Sterling merger than to seduce you into a compromising position?" Alexander's mind raced through every conversation he'd had with Emma, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But all he could remember was her honesty about her past, her dignity in the face of his initial cruelty, and the growing warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. "You're suggesting she orchestrated our meeting at the restaurant? I'm suggesting she's been planning revenge for 8 years, and you've walked directly into her trap." Hartwell leaned forward. "Alexander, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father and I were friends for 40 years. Don't let a beautiful woman with a sob story destroy everything you've built." The door to Alexander's office opened, and Emma appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of casual elegance that made his chest tight every morning. She stopped when she saw the gathering, her eyes quickly assessing the tension in the room. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting," she said, but her gaze had already found the photographs scattered across Alexander's desk. Richard Hartwell stood, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Miss Blackwood, how lovely to finally meet you properly. Though I believe we've met before, at several charity events back when your family was still relevant." Emma's composure didn't crack, but Alexander saw her hands tighten on the coffee cups. "Mr. Hartwell, I remember you from those events. You always spoke so fondly of your cousin David." The name hung in the air like poison. Alexander watched Emma's face, looking for any sign that Hartwell's accusations might be true, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "David was troubled by what happened to your family," Hartwell said. "The guilt ate at him until it killed him." "Guilt is a powerful emotion," Emma agreed quietly. "It can drive people to desperate actions." Alexander couldn't read the undercurrents flowing between them, but the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Something was happening here that went far deeper than business concerns or romantic skepticism. "Emma," Alexander said slowly, "perhaps you could give us some privacy to finish our meeting." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something die in her eyes, a trust or hope that had been growing between them over the past 3 weeks. "Of course," she said. "I understand completely." After she left, Hartwell turned back to Alexander with grim satisfaction. "You see how she manipulates situations, how she positions herself as the victim while inserting herself into private business discussions. She brought me coffee, Richard. That's hardly industrial espionage." "It's surveillance, Alexander. She's gathering intelligence on our merger, probably planning to sabotage it at the worst possible moment." Hartwell gathered the photographs. "I'm giving you a choice. End this engagement immediately, publicly and definitively, or the Hartwell-Sterling merger is dead. I won't risk 4 generations of my family's legacy on your romantic delusions." Alexander stared at the older man, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in. The merger wasn't just business. It was his legacy, his proof that he'd surpassed even his father's achievements. Without it, Sterling Industries would remain successful, but never legendary. "How long do I have to decide?" 24 hours. "But Alexander, if you choose her over this deal, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. And unlike romantic disappointments, business mistakes like this don't heal with time." After Hartwell left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the city spread out below his windows. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was balanced on the edge of a knife. On one side lay the business deal that would cement his place among Manhattan's most powerful men. On the other side lay a woman who had walked into his life through a cruel bet and somehow become. What? What was Emma to him, really? That evening, Alexander found Emma on the penthouse terrace, looking out over the city lights. She'd changed into a simple black dress that somehow made her look more elegant than any of the designer gowns he'd bought her. "You're going to choose the merger," she said without turning around. Alexander joined her at the railing, maintaining careful distance between them. "It's what makes sense from a business perspective." "Of course it does." Emma's voice held no anger, only a tired resignation. "Richard Hartwell made his case quite convincingly, I'm sure. He thinks you're using me to get revenge on his family." Emma turned to face him then, and Alexander was shocked to see tears in her eyes, the first real emotional vulnerability she'd shown since moving into his home. "And what do you think, Alexander?" He wanted to tell her that he thought Hartwell was a paranoid old man clinging to outdated prejudices. He wanted to say that the past 3 weeks had shown him a woman of intelligence, dignity, and unexpected humor. He wanted to admit that somewhere between her piano performance and her quiet strength, he'd begun to fall in love with her. Instead, he heard himself say, "I think I can't afford to find out," or to... Emma nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer. "I'll be out of your penthouse by tomorrow evening. You can announce that our engagement was a mistake, that you've come to your senses. Your precious merger will be safe." She started to walk past him toward the door, but Alexander caught her arm. "Emma, wait. I need to ask you directly. Is Hartwell right? Are you here for revenge?" Emma looked down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "Alexander, if I told you the truth about why I'm really here, would you believe me? Or would you assume I was lying to protect my position?" The question hung between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Alexander released her arm, and Emma disappeared into the penthouse, leaving him alone with the city lights and the growing certainty that he was about to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later that night, as Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through the penthouse. Emma was playing something he didn't recognize, a mournful, beautiful piece that seemed to capture all the sadness of dreams dying and chances lost forever. By morning, the music had stopped, and Alexander Sterling began preparing to choose his empire over his heart. Alexander's sleep was shattered at 3 a.m. by the insistent buzzing of his phone. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and his assistant never called at this hour unless the world was ending. "Sir," Margaret's voice was tight with urgency, "you need to see the morning news, all channels, now." Alexander stumbled to his living room and turned on the television, flipping through channels until he found the breaking news report. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Shocking revelation about the Blackwood Industries scandal that rocked Manhattan 8 years ago, the CNN anchor was saying. New evidence has surfaced, proving that Jonathan Blackwood was indeed framed by his business partner, David Hartwell, in an elaborate scheme to hide massive embezzlement and securities fraud. Alexander's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his sofa as the report continued. The evidence was discovered in a safety deposit box registered to David Hartwell, accessed only after his death 2 years ago by Swiss authorities investigating international money laundering. The box contained signed confessions, forged documents, and recorded conversations proving that Hartwell orchestrated the entire scheme to frame his partner when federal investigators got too close to their offshore accounts. The screen filled with documents, David Hartwell's handwriting confessing to years of embezzlement, detailed plans for framing Jonathan Blackwood, and most damning of all, recordings of Hartwell laughing about destroying that naive fool Jonathan while transferring millions to hidden accounts. Alexander's phone rang. Richard Hartwell's name appeared on the screen, but Alexander let it go to voicemail. He was too stunned to speak, too horrified by the implications of what he was seeing. The news anchor continued. Perhaps most heartbreaking is this final recording, made just days before David Hartwell's suicide, where he expresses remorse for destroying an innocent family. David Hartwell's voice, thick with guilt and alcohol, filled Alexander's living room. "Jonathan Blackwood was the most honest man I ever knew. He trusted me like a brother, and I destroyed him to save my own skin. His daughter, Emma. God, she was just a kid with dreams of being a concert pianist. What did I do to them? What did I do?" Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Sir, Richard Hartwell just issued a statement withdrawing from the merger indefinitely. He's claiming he needs time to process his family's tragic scandal. The financial press is calling it the collapse of the decade." But Alexander barely registered the business implications. All he could think about was Emma's face when he'd chosen the merger over believing in her. Emma, who had been telling the truth all along. Emma, whose family had been destroyed by the very people Alexander had chosen to trust over her. He found her in the guest suite, packing the same 2 modest suitcases she'd arrived with 3 weeks earlier. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression was calm. Too calm, the kind of composure that came from years of practice at surviving devastating disappointment. I suppose you've seen the news, she said quietly, folding a silk blouse with careful precision. Emma, Alexander stopped, realizing that no words could adequately express his shame and regret. I'm sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry. Are you? Emma continued packing, not looking at him. Or are you just sorry that your business deal fell through anyway? The question hit him like a physical blow because part of him wasn't sure of the answer. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you over Hartwell. Yes, you should have. Emma closed one suitcase and started on the second. But you didn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you versus what your business empire means to you. Alexander stepped into the room, desperate to make her understand. Emma, please, give me another chance. Let me prove that I can choose you over everything else. Emma's laugh was bitter. Alexander, you had your chance to choose me. You had your chance to believe in me, to trust me, to see me as more than just a potential threat to your precious deals. And you failed. People make mistakes, Emma. People learn from their mistakes. Some mistakes can't be undone. Emma straightened, meeting his eyes directly. Do you know what the worst part of this is? It's not that you chose business over me. I expected that from a man like you. The worst part is that for 3 weeks I actually believed you were different. I thought maybe, just maybe, you were falling in love with me the way I was falling in love with you. The admission hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest at the realization that he'd had something precious and rare, and he'd thrown it away for a business deal that had crumbled anyway. You were falling in love with me? He asked quietly. Emma's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. God help me, yes. Despite everything, your arrogance, your cruelty at that restaurant, your assumption that I was beneath you, I was falling in love with the man I saw in quiet moments. The man who asked thoughtful questions about my music, who listened when I talked about my dreams, who made me feel like maybe I could trust someone again. Alexander moved closer, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. Emma, I was falling in love with you too. I am in love with you. That's why this is so hard. That's why I'm terrified of losing you. But not terrified enough to choose me when it mattered. The simple truth of it was unbearable. Alexander had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But with Emma, he'd let fear override his heart when his heart was finally telling him something important. What can I do? He asked desperately. How can I fix this? Emma wiped her tears and picked up her suitcases. You can let me go, Alexander. You can let me walk out of here with whatever dignity I have left, and you can go back to your empire building and your mergers and your safe, calculated life. I don't want that life without you in it. Then you should have thought of that yesterday when you chose Richard Hartwell's word over mine. Emma walked toward the door, but Alexander blocked her path. Please, just tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this right. Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw 8 years of pain and disappointment in her green eyes. I want you to mean it when you say you love me. I want you to choose me not because it's convenient or because your business deal fell through anyway, but because you genuinely believe I'm worth more than any deal, any merger, any amount of money. You are worth more than any of that. Prove it. How? Emma smiled sadly. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, Alexander. Grand gestures are easy when you have unlimited money. But real love, real trust, real commitment, those require something you've never been willing to give anyone. What's that? Faith. Faith in another person without guarantees, without safety nets, without assurance of profit or return on investment. Emma stepped around him toward the door. When you're ready to love someone with that kind of faith, call me. Until then, goodbye, Alexander. She was gone before he could respond, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of devastating truth in her words. Alexander stood in the empty guest suite, surrounded by the wreckage of the best thing that had ever happened to him, and realized that for all his business acumen, he'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Some gambles were worth taking, not because you were guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that really mattered. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling understood what it meant to feel truly poor. Outside his windows, Manhattan sparkled in the early morning light, but Alexander barely noticed. He was too busy figuring out how to prove to the woman he loved that she was worth more than his entire empire, and wondering if he was brave enough to actually do it. 2 months after Emma left, Alexander Sterling had systematically dismantled every assumption about himself that he'd built over 34 years. The revelation of David Hartwell's guilt had done more than vindicate Emma's family. It had forced Alexander to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd inherited his father's prejudices along with his business empire. He'd spent weeks in therapy, learning to recognize the difference between calculating risks and refusing to be vulnerable. He'd restructured Sterling Industries to prioritize ethical practices over maximum profit. And most importantly, he'd begun the painstaking process of locating every person who had suffered when the Blackwood family fell, quietly making financial amends without fanfare or credit. But none of that mattered if he couldn't find Emma. She'd vanished from New York as completely as if she'd never existed. Her Queens apartment had been vacated, her former co-workers at the restaurant had no forwarding address, and even his most skilled private investigators had come up empty. Emma Blackwood had learned how to disappear from 8 years of survival in the shadows of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen knocked on his office door on a rainy Thursday evening with an expression that suggested good news for the first time in months. "Sir, I found her." Alexander's heart stopped. "Where?" "Boston. She's been working as a piano instructor at the New England Conservatory, using her maiden name and teaching under a program for underprivileged children." Margaret handed him a file. "She's also been living in a small apartment near the school and apparently playing weekend gigs at a jazz club in Cambridge." Alexander stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly. "How long has she been there?" "Since about a week after she left New York. Sir, there's something else. I made some discreet inquiries, and it appears she's been donating most of her salary to a scholarship fund for children whose families have faced financial disasters. She's calling it the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Fund." The information hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in self-pity and business restructuring, Emma had been quietly building something beautiful from the ashes of her own tragedy. "Margaret, I need you to charter a flight to Boston tonight." "Sir, it's nearly 10 p.m. "Tonight, Margaret, and call the conservatory's dean. I want to make a donation. A large one." The New England Conservatory was a beautifully preserved building that spoke of musical traditions stretching back generations. Alexander arrived at noon the next day, his heart hammering as he followed the sound of piano music through elegantly appointed hallways. He found Emma in a small practice room, working with a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Through the glass door, Alexander watched her demonstrate a passage with the same fluid grace he remembered, her face animated with the joy of teaching. She was wearing a simple navy dress and had cut her hair shorter, just to her shoulders, but she was every bit as beautiful as his memory had insisted during the long nights without her. More beautiful, actually, because she looked genuinely happy for the first time since he'd known her. When the lesson ended and the young student left, Alexander knocked softly on the door. Emma looked up, and the blood drained from her face when she saw him. "Hello, Emma." "Alexander." She stood slowly, her hands smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture he remembered. "What are you doing here?" "Learning to take the kind of gamble that has nothing to do with business profit." Emma's eyes were guarded, but he caught a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What does that mean?" Alexander stepped into the practice room, close enough to smell her familiar perfume, but careful not to invade her space. "It means I've spent the last 2 months figuring out the difference between wanting something and deserving it. It means I've been in therapy, learning why I was so terrified of trusting you that I chose to trust Richard Hartwell instead." "And what did you learn?" "That I spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from exactly what you were offering me. Real intimacy, real trust, real love without conditions or contracts." Alexander took a shaky breath. "I learned that I was a coward who was more afraid of being vulnerable than I was committed to being worthy of you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Those are important lessons, Alexander. I'm glad you learned them. But learning them doesn't automatically make everything okay between us." Alexander nodded. I know. That's why I'm here to prove that I've changed, not just promise that I have. How do you plan to do that? Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. By doing something that goes against every business instinct I've ever had. Emma took the document, her eyes widening as she read. This is a transfer of 50% of Sterling Industries to the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Foundation. With you as the sole trustee, empowered to direct how those profits are used. No oversight from me, no conditions, no strings attached. Alexander's voice was steady despite his racing heart. Half my empire, given freely to you to use as you see fit. Emma stared at the document, then at him. Alexander, this is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's proof that I value you more than money. It's proof that I trust you completely, without guarantee of return on investment. It's proof that I choose you over everything else, even when, especially when, I have no idea whether you'll choose me back. Emma set the document on the piano bench with trembling hands. You can't just throw money at this problem, Alexander. I'm not throwing money at the problem. I'm giving you the power to fix problems for thousands of other people, the way I should have had the power to fix your family's problems 8 years ago if I'd been paying attention to anything besides profit margins. Emma's eyes filled with tears. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Alexander said simply. If you take that money and use it to help people and never speak to me again, I'll consider it the best investment I ever made. If you take it and give me a chance to prove I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive. Emma turned to look out the practice room window at the students crossing the courtyard below. You know what the hardest part of loving you was? What? Knowing that you had the capacity to be everything I needed, but watching you choose to be less than that because it felt safer. She faced him again. You broke my heart, Alexander. Not because you chose your business over me, but because you chose fear over love. I know, and I'm sorry. Not just sorry that it happened, but sorry that I was the kind of man who let it happen. Emma wiped her eyes. The man I fell in love with, the one I saw in quiet moments, would never have made the choice you made that night. Then let me prove I can be that man consistently, not just in quiet moments. Alexander stepped closer. Emma, I love you. Not because you're beautiful, or talented, or intriguing, but because you make me want to be better than I am. You make me want to deserve the kind of love you're capable of giving. And how do I know you won't get scared again when things get difficult? Alexander smiled, and Emma was startled to see that it was different from his old smiles, warmer, more genuine, less calculated. Because I'm more scared of losing you than I am of being vulnerable with you. Because I've learned that the biggest risk isn't opening my heart, it's keeping it closed and missing out on the kind of love that makes everything else meaningless. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting for her verdict. The scholarship fund, she said quietly. What about it? I want to expand it. Not just for families facing financial disaster, but for any child who shows musical promise but can't afford training. I want to create a network of programs across the country. Alexander's heart began to race. That sounds like an incredible use of resources. It would take years to build. I'd need someone I could trust completely to help manage the business side while I focused on the educational programs. I can think of someone who might be qualified for that position. Emma's smile was small but genuine. Can you? Someone with business experience but also a commitment to putting people before profits. Someone who's learned that the most important skill in business is knowing when not to be businesslike. Emma laughed, and the sound was like music to Alexander's ears. And what would this person want in return for such a commitment? The chance to wake up every morning next to the woman he loves. The opportunity to build something meaningful together instead of just building an empire. Maybe a lifetime of piano concerts in the evenings and quiet conversations over dinner. Emma stepped closer, close enough that Alexander could see gold flecks in her green eyes. That sounds like a significant long-term investment. The best investments always are. And you're prepared to make that kind of commitment, without guarantees, without certainty of success. Alexander reached up to touch her face gently. Emma Blackwood, I'm prepared to love you with the kind of faith that doesn't require guarantees. I'm prepared to choose you every day, in every situation for the rest of my life. I'm prepared to be the man you saw in me before I was brave enough to see him in myself. Emma leaned into his touch, and Alexander felt his world shift back into focus for the first time in 2 months. Alexander Sterling, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I'm asking you to let me spend my life proving that some gambles are worth taking, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that matters. Emma's kiss was her answer, sweet and certain, and full of the promise of second chances and hard-won wisdom. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. So, Emma said, wiping his tears with her thumb, I suppose we have a foundation to run and a wedding to plan. I suppose we do, Alexander agreed, though I should warn you. I'm thinking of making this wedding significantly more elaborate than a restaurant bet. Emma's laugh was pure joy. Well, I should warn you that I'm thinking of inviting some of my piano students to perform at the reception. Perfect. I'll make sure to have several pianos available, just in case you decide to make any more foolish wagers. Alexander pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Emma, I've already made the only wager that matters. I'm betting my heart on us, and this time I'm confident we both win. Outside the practice room windows, Boston autumn afternoon light filtered through the conservatory's historic architecture. But Alexander and Emma only had eyes for each other and the future they would build together. One built on love, trust, and the kind of faith that turns the most impossible gambles into the most beautiful victories.